between 1960 and 1971. At the University of Cincinnati, 88 cancer patients were exposed to some of the highest doses of whole-body radiation ever deliberately administered to human beings outside of a weapons test. Most of them were black. Most of them were poor. Most of them were never told what was actually being done to them. And for nearly 3 decades, the government made sure almost nobody found out. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is documented. This is in the congressional record. This is in the declassified Pentagon files. This is in the findings of a presidential advisory committee that spent 18 months reviewing thousands of pages of evidence. And this is one of the most disturbing chapters in American medical history that somehow never makes it into the textbooks. If you are new here, this channel exists to uncover the history that was buried, sealed, or simply never spoken out loud. We cover the gaps, the erasures, the moments when powerful institutions used powerless people as instruments and called it science. Subscribe if that matters to you. Drop a comment and tell me where in the world you are watching from. Now, let us talk about Cincinnati. In 1960, a radiologist named Eugene Sanger received a grant from the United States Department of Defense. The grant was not primarily about treating cancer. It was about understanding what happens to soldiers when they are exposed to nuclear radiation on a battlefield. The Cold War was at its absolute peak. The Pentagon wanted data. Specifically, they wanted to know how much radiation a human body could absorb before it became combat ineffective. They wanted to know how cognitive function degrades, how fast, at what threshold, what the timeline looks like between exposure and incapacitation. And they needed human subjects to find out, because animal data alone was not going to satisfy the military requirements for projecting nuclear warfare readiness. Eugene Sanger was a respected physician. He had credentials and decades of experience in radiology. He had a laboratory at the University of Cincinnati and access to a patient population at Cincinnati General Hospital, which served the city indigent and largely black community. And he had a government check that would keep coming for 11 years. The experiments ran from 1960 to 1971. Patients who came to Cincinnati General with cancer were selected for the program. They were told they were receiving treatment. Some consent forms were signed throughout the course of the program, but investigators who later reviewed those forms found that the language was vague in ways that mattered enormously. Patients were not clearly told that the primary purpose of the radiation they were receiving was military research rather than their own medical benefit. The forms did not explain that the doses being used far exceeded anything that could reasonably be called therapeutic. Many of the patients had limited formal education. Several spoke English as a second language. The ability of those patients to provide genuinely informed consent, meaning consent based on full understanding of what was happening and why, was, by any reasonable standard, not present. Several family members of patients who died in the program later told journalists and investigators that their loved ones had no idea they were part of an experiment at all. They thought they were getting help. They thought the doctors had found something that might give them more time. They trusted the hospital because they had nowhere else to go, and the hospital was where you went when you were sick and could not pay for anything better. The doses were not small and they were not cautious. We are talking about whole-body radiation exposures of 25 to 300 rads delivered in a single session to a single patient. To put that in context that your body can understand, radiation workers in the United States today are legally limited to a maximum of 5 rads per year as their total occupational exposure. The patients in Cincinnati were receiving up to 60 times that annual limit in a single sitting. The immediate effects were predictable and severe. Nausea, vomiting, profound disorientation, bone marrow suppression that crippled the immune system, a collapse of the body ability to produce the blood cells that keep infection from becoming fatal. Some patients died within days of their exposure, others died within weeks. The question of whether the radiation killed them or whether the cancer killed them was, in many individual cases, genuinely impossible to answer with certainty. And that ambiguity was not an accident of circumstance. It was, some investigators would later argue, a structural feature that made the program easier to defend and harder to prosecute. What makes this story particularly difficult to absorb is the selection pattern, which was not random and was not arbitrary. Of the 88 patients who went through the program over those 11 years, the overwhelming majority were Black Americans from Cincinnati's poorest neighborhoods. They came from a hospital that specifically served patients who had no other healthcare options. They did not have private physicians who might ask inconvenient questions about why the radiation dose seemed unusually high. They did not have lawyers on retainer. They did not have the institutional connections or the cultural leverage to push back against a white man with a medical degree who told them this was their best chance at getting better. The power differential was total, and it was not incidental to the program. It was the precondition for the program. Sanger team tracked their patients with considerable precision, blood samples collected at regular intervals, cognitive function tests administered before and after exposure, measurements of how quickly the patient's mental processing declined following each session, how many days passed before they could no longer perform basic tasks. All of this data was compiled into detailed reports sent to the Department of Defense. The patients received none of this information. Their families received none of it. The reports were not shared with the people whose bodies had generated the data. The program continued for over a decade with almost no outside scrutiny. It was funded through official Pentagon channels. It was reviewed and approved by whatever institutional oversight existed at the time. It was published in limited form in military and specialized medical literature, and it was essentially invisible to the public and to the majority of the medical community. Then, in 1971, a junior faculty member at the University of Cincinnati obtained internal documents describing the program and brought them to a journalist. In November of that year, a story appeared in a local Cincinnati newspaper describing the experiments in enough detail to generate a political reaction. The story reached Congress. Hearings began. The university conducted an internal review. The internal review concluded that the experiments had been conducted ethically and that the consent process had been adequate. The Pentagon continued to classify significant portions of the underlying research. The junior faculty member who had provided the documents to the press was, by multiple later accounts, subjected to professional pressure that effectively ended his position at the university. And the story, which had briefly surfaced, faded back into the kind of silence that institutions are very good at producing when they need to. It would be nearly 20 years before the story returned with enough force to stick. In 1993, investigative journalist Eileen Wellsome published a series of articles in the Albuquerque Tribune about government radiation experiments conducted on American citizens throughout the Cold War. Her work rode a broader wave of declassification following the end of the Cold War. Files, sealed for decades, were becoming available through Freedom of Information requests. And what those files showed was that Cincinnati was not a standalone event. It was one node in a much larger network. President Clinton established the Advisory Committee on Human Radiation Experiments in 1994. The committee spent 18 months reviewing thousands of documents. What they found was a systematic pattern. From the 1940s through the 1970s, the United States government had funded and directly conducted radiation experiments on human subjects at hospitals, prisons, mental institutions, and military facilities across the country. Patients with cancer, prisoners told that participation would improve their parole prospects. Soldiers ordered into trenches a few thousand feet from nuclear detonations. Pregnant women given radioactive iron without being told it was radioactive. Children in state custody fed radioactive oatmeal as part of a nutrition study. People who were poor, institutionalized, incarcerated, or otherwise unable to refuse in any meaningful sense of that word. The Cincinnati experiments occupied a prominent and damning position in the committee final report. The committee found that the consent process had been fundamentally inadequate, that patients had not been clearly informed of the military purpose driving the research they were enrolled in, that the radiation doses administered were dramatically higher than any genuine therapeutic intent could justify, and that the consistent selection of predominantly Black, Low-income patients from a charity hospital raised serious and unresolved questions about whether race and class had functioned as the actual selection criteria determining who bore the physical risk of the program. Eugene Sanger disputed these conclusions throughout the rest of his life. He maintained that the patients had received adequate information and argued that the research had genuine dual value, both military and clinical. He said some patients achieved survival outcomes that surprised his team. He was never criminally charged, never stripped of his medical license, never formally sanctioned by any professional body. He continued to practice and receive professional recognition until his death in 2007 at the age of 90. In 1994, the families of the patients who had died in the experiment filed a federal lawsuit against the University of Cincinnati and the city of Cincinnati. The litigation ran for years. A settlement was reached in 1999. The university and the city together paid approximately $3.6 million to the families of 87 of the 88 subjects. The settlement included a standard clause that has become familiar in cases like this: no admission of wrongdoing. There is a memorial on the University of Cincinnati campus today. It was dedicated in 1994, the same year the lawsuit was filed. It is made of stone. It lists the names of the patients. It stands near a building where people move through their days without stopping to read what is written there, because memorials that are not actively taught become background, and background is one of the quietest forms of forgetting. Here is the question that this history forces us to sit with, and it is not a question with a comfortable answer. The radiation experiments in Cincinnati were not the work of rogue scientists operating outside institutional sanction. They were funded by the Department of Defense of the United States of America. They were reviewed and approved by the oversight mechanisms that existed at the time. They were conducted at a respected research university. The results were compiled and submitted to a government agency. The system worked exactly as it was designed to work, and the patients still died without understanding why they were really in that room. This is what buried history looks like. It does not always look like a burned archive or a secret kept in a basement. Sometimes it looks like a Department of Defense grant approval. A consent form written in language that satisfies the legal requirement without actually informing the person signing it. Reports filed with an agency that classifies them for 30 years. A settlement agreement that pays the families and closes the case and removes the institutional motivation to ever discuss it again. The burial is administrative, and administrative burial is some of the most effective burial there is, because there is no smoke, no obvious crime scene. There is just paper, process, and the passage of time. The Tartaria framework, the lens this channel applies to the histories that official institutions prefer to leave undisturbed, is not simply about lost civilizations or altered cartography, though those questions matter. The deeper pattern is about the architecture of the record itself. Who controls what goes into the archive? Who decides what gets classified, and for how long? Who determines which experiments become cautionary tales in medical ethics courses and which ones get settled out of court and quietly shelved? Who decides that the story has been told and the chapter is closed? The 88 patients at Cincinnati General did not make any of those decisions. They went to a hospital because they were sick and had no other options. They trusted the institution because that is what you do when you have nowhere else to turn. And the institution directed that trust toward a purpose that had nothing to do with those patients getting better. The families of those patients spent decades not knowing. Some of them never found out at all. The ones who did find out learned it from a newspaper, from a lawsuit, from a presidential committee that itself only existed because a journalist in New Mexico kept pulling on a thread that the system had spent decades trying to make invisible. There is a sentence in the advisory committee final report that stays with me. It says, closely paraphrased, that the most vulnerable populations bore a disproportionate share of the risk in Cold War human experimentation, and that this disproportion was not accidental. It was structural. It reflected who was considered available, who was considered unlikely to raise questions, and who was considered, in the operational language of that era, suitable for research. Suitable for research. Hold that phrase for a moment. Think about the world that phrase requires in order to make sense. Think about what had to be assumed, unexamined, and unquestioned for that phrase to be applied to sick, poor, black Americans in a charity hospital in 1960, and for that application to produce 11 years of funded, approved, published research. This story is not closed in the sense that matters most. The settlement happened. The memorial was built. The committee issued its report. But the structural conditions that made the Cincinnati experiments possible did not disappear when the program ended in 1971. They did not disappear with the settlement in 1999. The relationship between poverty and who bears risk, the relationship between race and whose consent is treated as a genuine threshold versus a procedural box to check, the relationship between institutional power and who writes the final version of what happened. Those conditions are not historical relics, they are present tense. The names on that stone on the University of Cincinnati campus are not simply a record of something that happened in the past. They are a record of something the system allowed, funded, defended, and then settled quietly and agreed to call resolved. We are not required to call it resolved. The history that gets buried is buried for reasons. The burial itself is information. And the act of digging, of reading the documents, of saying the names out loud, of refusing to let the administrative closure function as the moral closure it was designed to perform, that act is not trivial. It is the minimum that history asks of us. Dig anyway.